Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Israel's emergency service says 3 people have been killed in the latest Iran attack, even after President Trump announced a ceasefire he says will end the fighting. Oil prices fell after Trump announced the tentative ceasefire, with the agreement expected to lower crude's risk premium. The proposed ceasefire deal follows a measured Iranian attack on a U.S. base in Qatar that caused no casualties. Well, it has just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. As of now, at this point, we are scheduled to see the ceasefire that President Trump announced on Truth Social go into effect. We are waiting for confirmation. Nothing official yet from Israel, and indeed no official commentary from Iran, even though the Iranian foreign minister suggested that they would cease their attacks on Israel. That does not appear to be the case, because just in the last hour we are hearing of a volley of ballistic missiles being directed towards Israel, and the latest being the emergency service saying now 3 people have been killed. So questions about whether the ceasefire actually is going to be implemented, we're going to keep an eye on that throughout the course of the show. As for markets, this is the picture this morning. We are seeing a better risk-on environment. The mood obviously lifted by the developments over the last 24 hours and the fact that President Trump has taken the liberty of announcing the ceasefire between Israel and Iran. S&P futures up 0.6%. The handover from Asia Pacific, from Asia, pretty positive this morning. The broad composites up more than 2%. So very solid risk-on trading as we head into the European Open. 10-year yields not doing a whole lot. We are basically flat on the session, 4.33. I should also mention separately that the Fed Chair, Jerome Powell, will be delivering a testimony to both the Senate Banking Committee and the House Committee tomorrow. So you want to watch out for those comments the next couple of days. And we've also heard some more dovish commentary out of Fed officials too. So that might be impacting where yields are trading. And then Brent, take a look at where we are. Sub $70, down 2.5% this morning, but of course down 9% since that very telegraphed Iranian attack on the U.S. base in Qatar. So much has happened in the last 12 hours. But let me just flip over, because I want to show you where the oil complex is trading versus where we were trading at the beginning of this war. And essentially, we fully erased the risk premium that was priced into the oil complex. We're basically back to where we were on Thursday levels about 12 days ago, which is why President Trump is calling this the 12-day war. But so much volatility in the oil space, and you can see now that Brent is trading sub $70. We have fallen 9% in the last 12 hours. Now back to the top story. Iran and Israel appear to be nearing a pause in their 12-day war. President Trump using his Truth Social platform to announce a ceasefire he said would begin around now. However, the exact timing is unclear, and Israel's yet to officially respond to Trump's announcement. We have heard from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, saying in a post on X that his country had no intention to keep retaliating against Israeli attacks after the morning hours. But within the past hour, the Israeli military said a 3rd wave of missiles was fired from Iran, sending citizens running to seek shelter. Trump's announcement comes just hours after Iran fired missiles at a U.S. base in Qatar. That attack had all the hallmarks of an offer of de-escalation, with Iran saying it posed no danger to Qatar, which it called our friendly and brotherly country. Joining us now is Paul Wallace, Bloomberg's managing editor for economy and government in the Middle East and Africa. What a whirlwind the last 12 hours. First of all, what do we know about the ceasefire?
Really has been an extraordinary 12 hours or so. At the moment, all we know is what Donald Trump has said. And I think what's key at the moment is we've had absolutely nothing from Israel, not even a hint that it's either not going to adhere to what Trump has said or that it's on board with it. So we have to wait and see for that. What you mentioned at the top of your show, that we've had another 3 deaths in Israel from Iranian missile attacks, that's pretty significant. and I think, if, according to memory, these might actually be the first deaths in Israel for a week since about last Monday, because Iranian missile attacks had waned in the last few days, and they were almost all being intercepted. So that is a type of thing that could probably scupper Donald Trump's plans. We have to wait and see. You mentioned Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, there in his tweet. He mentioned 4 a.m. Well, we're well beyond 4 a.m. in Tehran. It's now about 7:30 in the morning there. So it's very unclear if what Trump said actually holds true and that we will see a ceasefire today.
Yeah, awaiting official comments from Israel also. Let me ask you about the attack, the Iranian attack on the U.S. base in Doha yesterday. The whole experience felt pretty surreal from our standpoint, from the moment that they announced that the airspace was closing to the explosions that were being heard in Doha. What is our interpretation of what Iran was trying to achieve?
I think Iran had to do something to save face, if nothing else, with its domestic population. And I think the Americans well knew that. It just depended what Iran would do and how spectacular and how aggressive that retaliation would be. In the end, it seemed like it was very choreographed, very calibrated, and there's even been speculation that Qatar knew that this was coming and was actually okay with it. The Al Udeid base that was targeted, which normally has about 8,000, 9,000 U.S. service members, was evacuated. The airspace in Qatar was closed down about an hour beforehand. A few hours before that, the U.S. Had urged its citizens in Qatar to seek shelter. So they knew it was coming. In fact, Donald Trump, in an extraordinary Truth Social post, even thanked Iran for the forewarning and said that they had now got it out of their system. And that is when oil markets dropped. Oil was plunging almost as soon as it became clear the Qatar attack wasn't serious.
So just to recap then, we are ostensibly supposed to be hearing about a ceasefire going into effect between Iran and Israel. But as for the Iranian retaliation to the U.S. strikes, is that done and dusted now? Have they sufficiently delivered the response and telegraphed it to the world?
It certainly seems that way. Iran didn't specify that last night and say, that's it, we're done. But by all implications, that's what it meant. And Trump seemed to take it that way, and so did the Americans. The Americans seem to think that this is Iran having done its thing, and we can call it even now.
Paul, thank you so much for the reporting. Paul Wallace, Bloomberg's managing editor for economy and government in the Middle East and Africa. Thank you. Now, let's bring in Robert Jordan, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Really good day to have you on, sir. Thank you very much for joining our show. Let's say this ceasefire actually does go into effect. And again, big question marks, because we're awaiting to hear official remarks both from Israel and from Iran. But assuming it does go into effect, what is the likelihood that it's going to be a lasting ceasefire?
Well, you never know, particularly in the Middle East, Germana. I think it's still an issue up for debate. A lot depends on the Israelis. There is some tension, I think, between the Trump administration and Netanyahu's cabinet right now. They may feel pressure in Israel to continue some sort of strikes. But my hope is that we'll see an opportunity for diplomacy. You do see ceasefires that have interruptions. They go back and forth. That's just the nature of these kinds of conflicts. But I think it's time, as President Trump said, for diplomacy, for some discussion about where we go from here.
Have the U.S. and Israel managed to deliver the fatal blow on Iran's nuclear ambitions?
We really don't know the answer to that yet. We're still seeing some battle damage assessments. There is a lot of concern that around 400 kilos of enriched uranium was extricated from the Fordo site before the bombing. And so I think we've also got to try to determine what Iran's intentions are. There's every likelihood that Iran will now go dark on pursuing a nuclear weapon. and withdraw perhaps from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have a lot of unknowns here that require all the parties to sit down and have some candid discussions.
I'm curious to hear what happens, obviously, with this ceasefire. But if, assuming the ceasefire does go ahead, does President Trump deserve any credit for getting it across the line? I.e., would this ceasefire have happened in the absence of U.S. military intervention, to your mind?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure we even know the answer to that yet. I think it showed enormous resolve on the part of the Americans. At the same time, it was a rejection of a diplomatic path that was actually underway with potential meetings in Turkey planned. We do know, apparently, that the Supreme Leader was unavailable to approve that meeting in Turkey, and it may have created an incentive for the Americans to go ahead with bombing the nuclear sites. I think we are seeing everyone recognize that we are on the brink here of either success or failure. We can't simply keep pushing the can down the road, and I think that hopefully will be a motivating factor to bring these parties together. We've got Qatar playing a diplomatic role, Turkey trying to play a diplomatic role. There's a lot of group support here, I think, in the region.
I guess it all just boils down to what the definition of success is, whether it's severely diminishing Iran's ballistic weapons, their ballistic missile capabilities, whether it is putting an end to their nuclear ambitions. And I say ambitions because obviously we're still sitting on the unknown whereabouts of that stockpile, the highly enriched stockpile, or whether the definition actually is a change of regime, which has been floated and talked about several times in the past week. And if that is the case, then this whole war has not been a success because the IRGC, well weakened, are still standing.
This whole idea of regime change, I think, is probably running away from the facts. My guess is President Trump mentioned regime change in the sense of empowering the Iranian people. But that's a sideshow, I think, and something that really needs to be put to the side as we try to manage a military conflict and a nuclear threat that really requires careful thought and diplomatic exchanges by the parties. You can't have a diplomatic exchange when you're trying to change the regime you're talking to.
Yeah. Let me round up with a question about Iran's very telegraphed, choreographed attack on the U.S. airbase yesterday in Doha. How significant was it that they chose the U.S. base situated in Doha, knowing that Qatar had been playing a key role in trying to reopen the diplomatic channels and trying to bring Iran back to the negotiating table with the U.S.? How significant is this in terms of a blow to Iran's, I would say, closer ties with the GCC states that have been enabled over the last few years?
Well, of course, Qatar and Iran are business partners in the world's largest gas field, and so they have communication lines between them that are quite important. My guess is careful notice was provided to Qatar, which went on, of course, to the military commanders at Al Udeid. But it is, I think, typical in situations like this where Iran might feel the need to save face, to impose some sort of retaliation. We saw this after Soleimani was killed several years ago under the first Trump administration. There was warning given, opportunity to clear certain target areas. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I wouldn't read too much into it. The Qatari government has protested the invasion of their sovereignty. Again, that's kind of a pro forma thing you would see done here. But my guess is Qatar will continue to play an important diplomatic role in bridging the gap between the Israelis, the Americans, and Iran.
Yeah. Interesting. Robert Jordan, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, thank you so much for your perspectives on this very crucial morning. Well, Well, still ahead, we'll get the global market outlook with Saxo as President Trump's ceasefire announcement spurs optimism that the worst of this Middle East conflict is over. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Bersetchi in Dubai. Oil has extended declines while stocks rallied after President Trump said Israel and Iran had agreed to a ceasefire. Joining us now is Charu Chanana, the Chief Investment Strategist at Saxo. Charu, the handover from Asian markets this morning is pretty positive. MXAP up around 2%. But the last couple of days, we've been having all of these discussions about how investors are brushing off geopolitical concerns. So if there wasn't that much risk premium embedded into equities, why are we trading so positive today?
Hi, Germana. Thank you for having me back. I think certainly there was some level of geopolitical risk premium priced in the oil markets, and that's where the impact was felt the most, in terms of the markets. We had the FX markets also responding to it. I would say a lot of the positive momentum that we saw in the US dollar really came on the back of the unwinding of the short bets also that had been accumulated against the greenback over the last few months. So we did see quite a response from the US dollar and the oil prices, and that is something obviously a place where that geopolitical risk premium is backing off for now. As for the equity markets, I agree with you. I think the markets had continued to shrug off this escalation that we saw in recent days, but this positive momentum is, I think, back to the point that now the markets can continue again to focus on economic policies, tariff policies, where inflation lands, whether the Fed cuts or not. So I think there's a little bit of a relief factor kicking in, if not the fading of the geopolitical risk premium here.
Yeah, I mean, and a week ago, yesterday, people were talking about the move upwards in the price of oil and the impact that could have on inflation numbers. Obviously, now we're back to where we were before this war even started. Is it too early to read across to what this might mean for the Fed? Because last week they talked about potential inflation upside to come. But if oil prices are back to where they were, then maybe some of that inflation upside isn't going to materialize.
No, absolutely. I mean, we haven't seen the sustained higher oil prices, and that should certainly not be a big factor for what the Fed projects from here on. I think what we heard last week from the Fed chair was really about the tariff policies and what kind of impact that can have on prices over the period of the summer. Certainly, we've had some of the Fed members turning a little bit more dovish, for example, Waller and Bowman over the last couple of days. And I think we obviously hear from Chair Powell himself today. We will get to know more about what he thinks, but I think it's hard to expect at this point a huge turn from what he said just last week, which was, I think, more focused on the tariff and the fiscal policy rather than the geopolitics itself.
Yeah, let's talk about what we can expect out of the testimony, because, as you mentioned, there have been two Fed policymakers, Michelle Bowman and Chris Waller, who've suggested or hinted that maybe a rate cut could be on the table as soon as next month. So that's really interesting. How do you expect that dovishness to show up at all, if at all, in Powell's testimony the next few days?
Okay, so if we were to look at how dovish Powell could get, like I said, we cannot expect a huge shift from his tone that we got last week, because that will certainly start to send some concerns around Fed independence and the likes. So I think that best what we can get is some kind of a tone down in terms of tariff risks or fiscal policy risks really feeding into inflation. If he doesn't talk about that, waiting through the summer to watch how prices react, I think that could be a tone down. But more so, I think as we approach closer towards that July Fed meeting, I think it'll be interesting to watch how the Fed division really pans out. And if at all we were still to get a hold at the July meeting, do we really get a consensus on that hold or not? I think that will be really critical test for the markets.
After a lot of whipsaw action in 10-year yields a month ago, they sort of settled in around these levels. Do you have a view on the direction of where fixed income could go from here?
Certainly. I think, it's no strange behavior that the 10-year bonds did not really act as a safe haven, despite all this geopolitical escalation that we've had in recent days. And that comes on the back of those, inflation concerns that were somewhat feeding in because of the gains we saw in crude oil prices. While that has settled in a little bit now, I think, of course, for the long end yields particularly, it's still very important to watch what happens as we enter the months of July. We have the big, beautiful bill back on the radar. We have the NFP data coming out. We have the Fed meeting. So I think a variety of factors that could still feed into where the long end yields. And I think my sense here would be that we continue to see the steepening of the yield curve because those long end yields continue to remain pinned higher because of all of these risks.
Yeah. And final one, because you talked about the fact that U.S. Treasuries were not responding to some of the geopolitical risks, one indicator that was the USD. It's back to being an indicator, an asset that people want to own in times of great uncertainty. Do you think some of that questioning of the dominance of the USD can be put behind us now?
I would agree to that, Jamana. I think certainly, markets went too far questioning the U.S. exceptionalism story, how long that could last, and pivoted too strongly towards other regions, say Europe and emerging markets, particularly in Asia, I would say. And this whole rhetoric has been questioned once again because of the geopolitical escalation that we just saw. And I think it all raises a concern about the uncertainty of geopolitics, but also uncertainty of policy in general, which kind of, I think to me, it sends a signal that portfolio construction now needs a whole different approach because of the variety of factors, uncertainties that are being lined up in our way. So, of course, I think U.S. exceptionalism could fade a little bit further from here. But I think the massive run that we've had in, say, Europe particularly, I think it rests heavily on what kind of tariffs they get ultimately exposed to, whether these geopolitical risks come back on the radar or not. And I think those are things that can really that European market rally in check and keep a little bit of a focus towards U.S. allocation being still a little bit more heavy in portfolios.
Charu, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on our show today. So much to discuss. Charu Chanana, Chief Investment Strategist at Saxo. And coming up, we'll get the outlook for oil markets with VANDA Insights as investors reprice crude on signs of de-escalation in the Iran-Israel war. That and more ahead. This is Bloomberg. Here's a look at how equity futures are trading. A solid green across the board from S&P futures up 0.5%, European markets up 1.1% as markets focus on the possibility of a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. Oil obviously in focus as well. We've dropped around 9% in the last couple of hours, and this is where we are trading below $70. This is a live look at Jerusalem as IDF say they have identified a sixth wave of missiles coming through from Iran. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Questions around an Israel-Iran ceasefire announced by U.S. President Donald Trump. Moments ago, the Israeli military says it identified a sixth wave of missiles from Iran. Oil prices falling after Trump announced the tentative ceasefire, with the agreement expected to lower crude's risk premium. The proposed ceasefire deal follows a measured Iranian attack on a U.S. base in Qatar that caused no casualties. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johannesburg in Dubai. Markets and the whole world really trying to get their head around whether this ceasefire that was announced by President Trump on social media yesterday is actually going into effect, with IDF reporting a sixth volley of missiles being directed towards Israel just in the last half hour or so. It was supposed to go into effect half an hour ago. Doesn't seem to be the case. So we're going to keep a close eye on the developments vis-a-vis the potential reduction of geopolitical tensions in the region. But the markets are behaving as though this episode is behind us. We've got S&P futures trading up 0.6%. The handover from Asia Pacific, from these Asian indices, very positive as well, up 2% for the Asia Pacific bourse. 10-year yields basically flat on the day, 4.33%. Watch out for the Fed Chair Jerome Powell's testimony later today at the House Financial Services Committee, and then tomorrow at the Senate Banking Committee. And then Brent, 2.5% weaker on the session. We are trading below $70 and flipping over. I just want to showcase for you that pretty much all of the geopolitical risk premium that was priced into the oil complex has now been priced out. We are trading back at levels we were trading before Israel launched those first wave of attacks on Iran and what President Trump is calling the 12-day war. But again, just to remind viewers, it is unclear at this point whether that ceasefire has gone into effect. So we are keeping a close eye on developments and commentary that is coming through. Now, oil did decline after President Trump announced a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. Global benchmark Brent crude tumbling from a high of $81 early yesterday to trade around $69 to $70 this morning. So let's get the outlook with Raktim Katke, who leads our energy and commodities coverage in the Middle East. I talked about the price of oil there, but obviously volatility has been extreme as well. What do you make of the moves this morning?
Yeah, I think President Trump's comments seem to have taken a lot of risk out of the market. As you said, oil prices now are lower than what they were on June 13th or June 12th, when the day before the attacks. We also see a lot of this risk coming out through prompt spreads. That's the difference in prices between the nearest futures contracts. That has narrowed, which basically highlights that a lot of the risk is coming out. Now, what are market traders looking at? There was a big fear in the market that this war would affect Middle Eastern supply. We know that 30% of the world's supply comes from this region. There was concern that Iran would retaliate by hitting energy assets in the Middle East. That has not happened.
Yeah.
The second fear was about shipping. Would ships be attacked, affecting flow to the crucial Strait of Hormuz? That would have been a major event in the shipping and oil and energy markets worldwide. That has not happened so far. In fact, Iran has actually been sending more oil through the Strait of Hormuz, presumably in an effort to get more of its supply out of the region, running ahead of any restrictions. But having said all of that, it is also important to remember that Israel and Iran were still firing missiles at each other as of this morning.
Yeah.
And I guess we'll just have to wait and see when the ceasefire kicks in and how long it will last.
Yeah. So what are you going to be watching out for in the coming days? I mean, beyond obviously what goes on with the ceasefire, if it's actually implemented or not. Mm-hmm. Are we going back to fundamentals now? Are we going to be watching what happens with purely from a supply-demand perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the oil markets have been a little strange this past week, right? I mean, every time there's an event, oil prices spike and then come down immediately. Mm-hmm. But looking ahead, I think the markets are going to look very closely at what OPEC does when it meets early next month again. Is OPEC going to now again increase by what they have been doing, which 411,000 barrels per day? Will they see this as an opportunity to do something else? Markets will be very focused on that. There is already obviously a recommendation by various groups about a surplus coming later this year. What is China going to do? How is demand in China going to play out? So basically, I think a return to fundamentals while keeping an eye on all the events that are happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, Raktim, good way to summarize it. Thank you so much for coming on our show. That was Raktim Katke. Joining us now to pick up the conversation is Vandana Hari, founder of VANDA Insights. Vandana, your take on the volatility that we've seen in oil markets over the last week and the fact that we are simply back to where we were trading before this war started.
Good morning, Jumana. So in my estimate, crude has surrendered about 3/4 of the risk premium that had been injected as a result of the Israel-Iran conflict. So as we sit now and look at Brent at around $69, I think another $3 or $4 could be further removed. There is a bit of an uncertainty still hanging over the market and over this issue. Now, obviously, Trump's word carries quite a bit of weight, so not surprising that we've seen crude slump by 7% overnight. But just to remind ourselves, there's the two other key parties in this conflict, Iran and Israel. And as you were just mentioning earlier, and your colleague was referring to it as well, Iran has continued to fire missiles at Israel. I think what needs to happen next is we need to hear from Israel, because we haven't had any official word from Tel Aviv since Trump's social media post. So let's see if this fighting actually stops.
Yeah. So let me ask you about the upcoming OPEC meeting. That's happening on July the 6th. And over the last couple of days, many people, many analysts in your space have been talking about the fact that OPEC still are sitting on plenty of spare capacity. And so they could, if they wanted to, bring back more supply to the market, more production. Now, with Brent trading back at $70, will they be incentivized to go ahead with those big rollback of the voluntary production cuts as they have been doing in the last couple of months, or do you expect them to be more cautious?
So my base case, even before the outbreak of the Israel-Iran hostilities, was that the group of 8 members will continue on the path of an accelerated unwinding of the 2.2 million barrels per day of cuts. Now, Jumana, that has more to do with internal dynamics, I believe, within the group, specifically within these 8 members, than physical market fundamentals. It is aimed at preserving the cohesion within the group, especially as Kazakhstan has said quite clearly that it is not in a position to rein in output. So I do expect OPEC Plus to continue putting more oil into the market at an accelerated rate. Of course, we have seen quite a bit of divergence in OPEC's viewpoint, specifically the OPEC analysts in Vienna, in terms of what the market balances look like, and the likes of the International Energy Agency and the EIA, which see far more surplus in the coming months than what OPEC Plus does, or OPEC does. But as I said, I think internal dynamics is what is currently dictating OPEC's decisions.
Yeah, it certainly appears to be the case. How about some of the macro considerations as well? From a market standpoint, the Fed chair will be testifying the next couple of days to both the Senate and the House committees. And I wonder to what extent his commentary about the outlook and the potential for interest rate cuts, especially with other members of the committee now hinting that the next month could be live, whether that could influence the direction of travel for oil looking ahead.
Yeah, so indeed, what Fed does or doesn't do, and specifically its hold on interest rates for the past several months, especially, again, diverging from what we have seen with the ECB specifically, has been a major source of concern in the markets. Trump's constant criticism of Jerome Powell has also been another source of sort of worries in the market as to how that could pan out. So the market will indeed be keeping a very close eye on how Jerome Powell sees inflation panning out. We heard from him a few weeks earlier where he conveyed that the Fed was in a wait-and-watch mode with regard to the tariffs, how the tariff wars pan out. I think that all of that rotates back to the center stage, I feel, Jumana, once the dust settles on this Israel-Iran conflict. And when that happens, I expect the market to, and the oil market sentiment especially, to go into a very cautious wait-and-watch mode. The ongoing narrative that we have since the start of this year of economic headwinds as a result of these tariff and trade wars, and sluggish outlook for oil demand growth, while OPEC continues to put more oil into the market, I think that narrative remains dominant in my view. So, which is why I would expect Brent to possibly slide a little bit further towards the mid-60s. If Trump pulls a rabbit out of the hat with regard to the tariffs, tail risk of that happening, we could see a sort of a jump back in oil prices, but not my base case.
Okay. Yeah, Vandana, let's go back to where we started, the fact that oil prices are dropping. Also, vol is dropping as well. I'm taking a look at 1 month implied vol. We're down about 20 points since where we were a couple of days ago. Do you think the takeaway from all of this is if you want to position for a potential flaring up once again of geopolitical risk premium, then your best bet potentially is not to do it in spot, but to do it via vol markets?
I'm not an expert on that, but I will take note of the fact that even in the last several days, there was much more activity happening in the options market than on the futures market. What I will say, Jumana, is that I think this episode has proved again that going forward, I think traders will need to be extremely cautious, taking bullish bets when these kind of hostilities break out. I mean, we saw the same thing happen last April and October. Those were a little bit less frightening and probably a reason for less bullishness in crude than the latest outbreak. But ultimately, and this is what I have maintained over the past several days through the worst case scenarios, is that the worst case scenarios were actually never our base case scenarios at VANDA Insights. So I think traders will just generally need to be cautious on becoming overly bullish at the outbreak of such hostilities.
Vandana, so good to have you on, and thank you for tackling my last question well. Vandana Hari, founder of VANDA Insights. Coming up, more on U.S. President Trump's ceasefire announcement. Amir Handjani from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft joins me next. This is Bloomberg. We are continuing to watch developments on the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, on the potential ceasefire, I should say, which U.S. President Trump announced on his Truth Social platform. Trump said the truce would begin at the top of this hour, though we are hearing of further volleys, ballistic volleys, being sent towards Israel. IDF are reporting a sixth wave of missiles from Iran, and air defense systems in Tehran have also been activated as well. Joining me now is Amir Handjani, non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So much has happened in the last 12 hours. Let me just ask you about how you see the potential for this ceasefire. Could it be a turning point in this war?
Well, good morning, and it's nice to be with you. I think it's very delicate right now. It's unclear if the ceasefire is going to hold. It was very unusual. President Trump announced it with a tweet, but there was usually when there's a ceasefire, there's a certain time where both sides stop hostilities. In his tweet, it was a bit confusing. He gave the Israelis somewhere between 6 and 12 hours to continue their bombing campaign, and I think the Iranians took issue with that. And after the Israelis started that bombing campaign, Tehran got very hit heavily last night. They lobbed a number of ballistic missiles into Israel, and that situation is very tense. I think as of now, both sides have said that they're both keeping with the ceasefire, but as you said, they're just recently in the last 20 minutes, Iran has launched more ballistic missiles. So it's fraught. It's very fraught.
Yeah. Well, where does this all lead as far as the Iranian regime is concerned? Because they suffered multiple setbacks over the course of this quote-unquote 12-day war, which is what President Trump is calling it, from a leadership perspective, with many senior commanders taken out. Their nuclear sites have been hit. A lot of their missile capabilities have been depleted as well. Does this mean that they will have to return to the negotiating table with the U.S. because the U.S. have successfully applied pressure?
Well, Jumana, they were at the negotiating table. They were supposed to meet last Sunday in Oman. Israel started this war in the midst of the U.S.-Iran negotiation. Yes, they've suffered setbacks, no question. They've lost a number of IRGC commanders and generals. Infrastructure has been hit. But the three pillars of a nuclear program are enriched uranium, knowledge base, and infrastructure. The knowledge base is still there. The enriched uranium is still there. That's the ball game, really. And it's not clear that Fordo has been destroyed. It's certainly been damaged. And there are many parts of the Iranian nuclear program that we don't know about that are now going to go dark because Iran ostensibly is going to leave the NPT. So yes, they've suffered setbacks. They were already at the negotiating table. I'm sure they're going to come back to the negotiating table.
Okay, so let me ask you a question then. Do you think it's more likely now that Iran signs on to some of the concessions that the U.S. administration have been pushing for, i.e. a zero enrichment policy?
I don't. I think that's a red line for Iran. I think there has to be some sort of formula whereby Iran maintains some low level of enrichment for domestic purposes, but they are able to send the highly enriched uranium outside the country. I think that was always going to be the case. That was what was in the JCPOA. That was what Witkoff and Arakchi, the Iranian foreign minister, were negotiating towards, but then the U.S. administration flipped that in the last 2 weeks and said, now we're going to go to zero enrichment. If the U.S. holds that line, I find it very, very difficult for Iran to actually let go of its highly enriched uranium. I think they're going to keep it, and they're going to go dark with that nuclear program and probably try and weaponize it as a deterrent so this doesn't happen again.
Yeah. So let me just bring it back to your thinking then. What leverage do you think Iran still has then with the U.S. in terms of being willing to not agree to some of the concessions that are being offered? Because the U.S. has threatened more military intervention should Iran persist with their nuclear weapon ambitions.
Well, they didn't. I think the question is, what can the U.S. do to get Iran to stop domestically enriching? And that would be having this continuous wave of militarism, if you will, by Israel and the United States, whereby they're constantly launching airstrikes over Iran. And as we can see, that Iran's answer to that is to launch ballistic missiles into Israel. And yes, a lot of them don't get through, but some do get through, and they continue. Some just got through in the last hour, and they cause extensive damage. So the only way to settle the nuclear file with Iran is through negotiation and a diplomatic agreement. There's no military solution to the nuclear issue. As we see now, there's been 12 days of bombing. Iran has its highly enriched uranium. We don't know where that is now. That's a leverage point for them. As the U.S. and Israel prepare to continue to do airstrikes for months and weeks, I think that's highly unlikely. I don't think anyone has an appetite for that.
Yeah. Amir Handjani from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, very good to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us. And as you were speaking, some headlines have just come through from AP saying that Israel's skies are closed to planes until further notice. And a short while ago, we were just reporting that IDF had identified a sixth wave of missiles from Iran being directed towards Israel just in the last couple of hours. So it is unclear whether this ceasefire has been implemented. And as of now, Israel's skies are closed to planes until further notice, per AP. Well, coming up, government and business leaders and officials from across the U.S. and Africa are meeting in Angola. We'll have the latest from the U.S.-Africa Business Summit in Luanda next. This is Bloomberg. Angola's president is calling on U.S. companies to expand their investments in Africa beyond traditional oil and minerals to industries like autos, shipbuilding, and tourism. The comments were made at the opening of the U.S.-Africa Business Summit in the capital, Luanda. Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent, Jennifer Zawazaja, is there covering the summit and joins me now. Jen, just set the stage for us. What deals can we expect at this year's summit?
Right, Jumana, this is the 17th summit that the U.S. and Africa have had, but we should take a look at it. And what we've actually been hearing from a number of leaders is just how much has changed between these relationships. And namely, of course, this new administration, President Trump, has really taken a very different approach to the relationship with the continent. And so, yes, as we heard from Angola's president, they do want to diversify their forms of investment streams. But also, we should note, U.S. aid and a number of other financial commitments that we've seen in the past are not intact anymore. And so a lot of the deals are really centered around electricity and connecting a lot of the billion people who are across the continent, who are ultimately going to be the workforce of the future, but then also supporting the Anchor project, which former President Biden, and also President Trump's administration have touted, which is this Lobito corridor. We saw $100 million commitment to continue to accelerate that project and continue to connect a lot of the host countries that are a part of this project. But really, this whole entire summit has been shaped by what we've seen over the past few months. Of course, you've been covering geopolitical events in the Middle East. That has an effect on the region, as does potentially the expiration of AGOA, which has been a partnership between the continent and the U.S. There's also oil prices that that could potentially affect inflation on the continent. There's also security concerns in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there's really a lot that are on the focus for private sector leaders and also government officials here at the summit.
Bloomberg's Jennifer Zabazaja, thank you so much. Well, that wraps up this episode of Horizons Middle East and Africa, keeping a close eye on all the developments out of the region. I'm Johanna Bersecci in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.